I haven't posted in a while. But last week's big story was, of course, about the death of 89-year-old Robert Redford, who died, and who really was a good guy. You know, he made a lot of difference in the world, or he tried to. He cared about his causes, such as the environment. He cared about helping young filmmakers make it in the world of film. He was just an all-around good guy. Okay, he had some tragedies along the way, and one of these I just finished reading was about his son James, who had died in 2020, and Redford and his wife had moved close to his son, to be close to his son and his family when his son was diagnosed with bile duct cancer and eventually died of it 5 years ago. But the article in the Mercury News talked about just that he really was without any kind of errors. You know, he wasn't a bit snob. He was just a regular guy, and everybody was talking about how nice he was. And it says here, for 4 years, he and his wife lived in a hillside cottage in Tiburon with spectacular views of Angel Island and San Francisco Bay. They enjoyed Tiburon's restaurants and promenade, looking out towards San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge, along with the community's walking paths and friendly vibe. And then they sold their house last year, and with Redford saying in an interview that they needed to spend more time in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where his artist wife had a gallery, and they both ran an arts nonprofit that produces work to promote global conservation efforts. Always, you know, right to the end, caring about the world, trying to do something good for the world. Just a great guy. You know, he started out in television, and notably in a Twilight Zone episode called Nothing in the Dark, which starred Gladys Cooper, I believe it was, and she was about to die, and here Robert Redford played this nice guy, but of course he was actually deaf, and she goes with him at the end of the show. I know I'm spoiling it, but you know, death never looked so good. Let me tell you, that was when he was young and he had his looks. But anyway, he went to Van Nuys High School. Even before that, he was born in 1936. He was about 2 weeks younger than my sister. So he had just turned 88. Or 89. He was just turned 89. Gosh, can't add. And he graduated from Van Nuys High School, and one of his classmates was Don Drysdale, the baseball great. And they graduated in 1954. And early on, Redford married quite young. He married a woman named Lola von Wegenen, who later, after their divorce, separation and divorce in the early 80s, she went and got back to school and got her doctorate and became a historian. And she remarried like he remarried. And she's still around. She's about 86 years old. But he had that career in television, and of course eventually he made it to the big screen, and we all know about all his movies that he was in, and then he turned to directing like so many and had a lot of success there. But you know, he just never was any kind of snob or arrogant or any of that stuff. Just totally admirable. And when I think of today, I thought a lot about him, because that's somebody that we should think about. Even though he was old and he had a full life, he was a positive influence. Not like that damned KKK rally. In effect, that's what it was in Arizona today. And I did not watch it. I saw little clips of our orange president, our orange Julius, there in Arizona giving a political rally. It was supposedly a memorial service to that Charlie Kirk. But it's always about him. It's always about Trump. And he was horrid. But that's to be expected. The whole thing was nothing but a Klan rally. And you point this out and you get people that say, oh, you know, those clips just take him out of context. Took Charlie Kirk out of context. There is no context to be taken out of. He was a white supremacist. He was a white nationalist. He was an Aryan Nations type guy who was not any different than David Duke. And he should have been marginalized like David Duke. But no, when he was in high school, he was noticed by some rich people because of his purported right-wing views while still in high school. Plus his daddy was also a vehement right-winger. And they promoted him. That's the difference between him and David Duke. But he should be in total disrepute. And he will be, as all of this comes to the fore about what he really was. And it's a disgrace. Absolute disgrace. So, they had that memorial service. And there were all those, and I guess there were just tens of thousands of people there. And of course, Erica, you know, his wife Erica, or widow, she's making a grift out of it, being a professional widow now. And I had initially felt bad about her and the kids. They weren't there. Purportedly, they weren't there at the rally. Thank God they weren't there and saw that. But she's milking it and then trying to go on some kind of war against whatever, and never mind, it was a lone kook who killed him. And it's still not really clear why he did it. It's going to probably, if there's ever a trial with this guy, this Tyler Robinson, or Robertson, whatever it is, when he goes on trial, that's probably when all this stuff will come out about motive and why he did it and all that stuff. There's just dribs and drabs and a lot of contradictory information. But it wouldn't have mattered what it was, what his motive was. The right wing was going to go and try to politicize this death, this murder. And they have. But now, you know, now we look at his own words. Charlie Kirk's own words. And it's all shit right out of the Idaho Panhandle of the Aryan Nations, which isn't in the Idaho Panhandle now. The headquarters isn't there. I think they moved to Tennessee. But the Panhandle has the likes of Doug Wilson and that scary ilk. And old Kirk was right up in that. Right in the same belief system. And it's really, you know, it's really terrifying that so many people are buying into stuff that should have been marginalized, that should never have been given a forum. But yeah, it's the comparisons between Kirk and George Lincoln Rockwell. And this is an article that was from 2017, so it was right after Trump got in the first time. But Trump made it fashionable to be a white supremacist, to be a goddamn Klansman. This shit should never have been given a forum. But the comparisons, and this is before Charlie Kirk was particularly well known. And for most people, he wasn't well known until he died. But on it says here, George Lincoln Rockwell on the day of the I Have a Dream speech. It says here, George Lincoln Rockwell, the media-savvy, pipe-smoking founder of the American Nazi Party, was blatantly racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic. Sounds familiar. Just 17 years after the U.S. and its allies had defeated Nazi Germany, he had tried to hold a rally celebrating Hitler's birthday in New York. In the capital, Rockwell had predicted that 10,000 angry counter-demonstrators would join him to protest King's March on Washington. He had also been spreading fears about black mobs attacking Congress. Instead, the Washington, D.C. Police Department, which Rockwell assumed would be on his side, had denied him a permit to demonstrate. That was absolutely should have. And so, more than 200,000 Americans joined King for a peaceful event that would reshape American history. Rockwell and fewer than 90 followers were surrounded by 100 police officers, The Guardian reported. When one supporter attempted to give a speech, he was arrested. And he always had a pipe, old Rockwell. Anyway, yeah, they did have undercover agents for others. Nonetheless, when King marched in Washington in 1966, he was greeted by thousands of angry white protesters, some holding signs that referenced Rockwell or carried slogans like "Join the White Rebellion" and "We worked hard for what we got," the Chicago Tribune reported. Rockwell died in 1967, murdered by one of his own followers. American neo-Nazi groups remained largely in obscurity, but of course, Trump has made it all fashionable. And this was at the time, this article was written during the Charlottesville thing. And yeah, and they talk about this. And this is right up Charlie Kirk's alley. Where Rockwell used explicit Nazi iconography, whatever, many new white nationalist groups have adopted alternative fascist symbols. They want to rebrand white supremacy, so the swastika is not so much a part of their movement. Rockwell doesn't seem to be venerated by these groups, but they use some of the tactics he promoted. However, strategies used by Rockwell to gain media attention, talks on college campuses, violent clashes without outraged opponents, debates over freedom of speech are replicated today. Well, yeah, guess by who? At least some of them. Charlie Kirk and his ilk. In 1960, for example, Rockwell made headlines with his reported support for Richard Nixon's candidacy for president. In 2016, white supremacists David Duke and Richard Spencer made headlines by endorsing Donald Trump. "I completely repudiate him and the evil he represents," Nixon said in 1960, according to the AP. But in 2016, Trump did not immediately disavow support from Duke. After Charlottesville, he drew fire for a delayed and equivocal response. That's because he's just like him. And now they get to have giant Klan rallies that aren't technically Klan rallies because they don't have the cross burnings and they don't have the clothing. And it goes on. This article goes on. Rockwell's most important legacy may be the instinct for showmanship. Rockwell was tall, dimpled, and telegenic, deploying a trademark corncob pipe and an instinct for dramatic poses. Swastikas deployed for effect, leveraging outrage into constant press attention. In 1961, he and his followers drove a Volkswagen emblazoned with the words "Hate Bus" throughout the American South, parodying the freedom riders who fought for civil rights reform. Many of his claims, among them the assertion that he would be elected president in 1972 on the National Socialist ticket, were clearly delusional. But he mastered the art of turning virulent racism and anti-Semitism into a spectacle the media could not resist. And it was played out again with Charlie Kirk. And it said, and this just like Kirk here too, like many of today's most prominent alt-right leaders and backers, Rockwell was not a member of the white working class. The son of a vaudeville star, he attended Brown University, where he drew comics for a campus newspaper, then served in the Navy in the Second World War in Korea. By 1952, Samanelli wrote in his 1999 biography, one of Rockwell's cousins was shocked by the vehemence which he was denouncing Jewish traitors. And it goes on. So anyway, so he failed, but his pernicious influence lives on. And also, I'm not a big fan of WSWS, but they do have good obituaries, I have to say. They're usually right on the money, even with the rhetoric that they use. And they also drew comparisons between Charlie Kirk and George Lincoln Rockwell. All of this being done while elevating to the stature of a national hero an individual whose political positions were undeniably fascist. If there is any individual whom Kirk most closely resembles in terms of persona and political tactics, it is George Lincoln Rockwell, the leader of the American Nazi Party in the 1960s. While his name has long been forgotten by the broad public, Rockwell remains a source of inspiration for the extreme right. He created the playbook that Kirk later followed, traveling to universities wearing a suit and tie rather than his Nazi uniform, to debate ideas with students and posturing as a defender of free speech. Rockwell, smoking an ever-present corncob pipe, presented himself as a political philosopher, thoughtful intellectual, and man of ideas, unafraid to argue with his enemies. Though a savage racist, Rockwell even attended a rally of the black Muslims in 1961. He used such media events to attract attention and recruit to his Nazi organization. Rockwell was eventually shot to death by a disgruntled member of his own party in August 1967. Though the killing was front-page news, the coverage was focused on the exposure of his politics. Flags were not lowered to half-staff, and not even the right-wing senators from the South delivered eulogies for the would-be American Hitler. The President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, took no official notice of Rockwell's death. But those were different times. Little more than 2 decades had passed since the end of World War II, and the racist politics and crimes of the Third Reich were still fresh in people's memories. Not only that, but also the lynchings and things like that happened with the gradual desegregation in America. And we have young people that are so far removed from those times, they fall sucker to this shit. And maybe as all of the truth comes out about Charlie Kirk and his ideas, maybe that narrative, well, I would think that narrative will eventually predominate once all this hoopla is done. And he ends up in obscurity just like Rush Limbaugh. And nobody even remembers Rush Limbaugh now. And we know how big he was. He didn't go quite as far as this guy. Yeah, and it needs to be pointed out that he's a fascist. You know, not be timid about it. The establishment media is observing a deceitful silence regarding Kirk's opposition to the Civil Rights Act, his denunciation of supposed Jewish control over politics and culture, his contempt for democracy, and his promotion of the neo-Nazi great replacement theory, according to which Jews and others are seeking to submerge whites beneath a sea of immigrants. The Trump administration's canonization of Kirk is of a piece with the attack on the Smithsonian for emphasizing how bad slavery was, and the rehabilitation of Confederate generals. In Kirk, the most reactionary factions of the ruling class have found a symbol for the offensive they are mounting: revival of the ideology of the slaveocracy in the service of the modern-day oligarchy. And you can't argue with that. It's not really arguable how vile this guy was. But in my life, you know, I preferred today and in the previous days to think of the life of Robert Redford and what good he did in the world, and not this scumbag who will be forgotten in, you know, in due time, once all the trial is over with and all that. The white supremacists, aggrieved males will find another demagogue to hitch their star to. Anyway, that is it.